Max Verstappen's final Dutch Grand Prix lasted one lap. Battling his own teammate Liam Lawson into the final corner, he lost the rear of his Red Bull on a damp patch and slammed hard into the barriers, bringing out an immediate red flag. His words over the radio said it all. "Yeah, that's it. Ah, shit, sorry." No podium, no fairy tale lap, no send-off. Just a four-time champion, unharmed but devastated, watching marshals clear his car from the exact corner where he'd once celebrated home wins. For an Orange Army that filled an entire grandstand for this one moment, it's hard to imagine a crueler way for Zandvoort to end. Here's exactly what happened, and what it actually means. Max Verstappen arrived at what's currently set to be his final Zandvoort as a sick man, became a steward's investigation before the sprint even started, and then spent the race stuck behind a struggling McLaren, unable to find a way past, no matter how many times he closed the gap. Three completely separate problems, stacked into a single 24-hour stretch of his home race weekend, arriving one after another almost as if the weekend itself had decided to test him. None of them, on their own, would be a huge story, the kind of thing that dominates a news cycle by itself or leads a broadcast segment on Sunday morning. Together, they're the actual account of what this weekend has looked like from the inside, underneath the contract headline everyone's already talking about after Thursday's announcement. The version of events that doesn't fit neatly into a single press release or a two-line news alert. Here's what Verstappen actually said about his condition, in his own words, to reporters in the paddock, rather than through a team statement or a carefully worded press release. "I've felt better, yes," he admitted. "Yeah, just not a lot of energy." Asked directly how severe it was, in front of a scrum of reporters clearly hoping for a dramatic answer, he didn't dress it up. "I just don't feel right. I'm simply sick, like anyone does when they're ill." He described it as flu-like symptoms that had been building steadily across the weekend, getting no better between sessions, adding, "I feel a bit flu-like, and I'm just not feeling as much energy as normal." To his credit, when asked whether it was affecting his driving, an easy opportunity to build in an excuse ahead of a potentially difficult result, his answer was flat. "No, I don't think so." Whether that's true or simply a driver refusing to hand the rest of the grid an excuse to exploit, the kind of thing drivers say almost on instinct regardless of how they actually feel, only Sunday's race will really tell. Then, before the sprint had even started, Verstappen found himself under formal investigation, alongside Yuki Tsunoda, Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, and Lance Stroll. The alleged offense, straightforward on paper, but genuinely nerve-wracking in the moment for anyone with a home crowd watching every camera angle, failing to follow the race director's instructions on the way to the grid. Specifically, all 5 drivers stopped their cars before reaching safety car line 1, technically meaning they hadn't reached the grid under their own power, a breach of the event notes for the weekend that could, in theory, have cost any of them a grid penalty for Sunday. A genuinely significant consequence for something that looked, on first glance, like a minor procedural slip. For a driver already carrying illness into his home race and already facing questions about a car that struggled all year, a steward's summons is the last complication anyone wants hanging over a sprint start, especially in front of a grandstand full of fans in orange who'd traveled specifically to see him race, not sit in a steward's room. Okay, before we go any further, make sure you're smashing that hype button, because this is where the tension actually gets resolved. Here's how it actually played out. The stewards reviewed broadcast footage and found the back of the grid had become extremely crowded, genuinely difficult for any of the 5 drivers to reach the required line safely. Their conclusion, delivered in the flat, procedural language stewards always use even for genuinely tense decisions. The driver acted appropriately and stopped the car in a safe spot as close as possible to the grid. Therefore, no penalty is applied. All 5 drivers, Verstappen included, were cleared without consequence. The entire investigation resolved within a couple of hours, rather than dragging into Sunday. A real scare, resolved by a straightforward, sensible ruling once the actual footage was examined, rather than left to assumption or speculation, which is really all anyone can reasonably ask of a stewards panel working through a genuinely ambiguous situation under time pressure. That's one crisis diffused, cleanly and without lingering controversy. The other two weren't going away as easily, and neither had a stewards panel waiting to resolve them. Because on track, the sprint itself was its own kind of disappointment. Verstappen started 6th and finished exactly where he started, spending most of the 24 laps stuck behind Oscar Piastri's struggling McLaren, unable to complete a pass despite closing the gap multiple times over the course of the race. His own explanation afterward was blunt, delivered with the dry, matter-of-fact tone he tends to fall into after a frustrating result. "I got stuck behind Piastri, who was struggling with his rear end. Massive oversteer. But then again, you simply cannot overtake around here. So that made it a tricky affair." He added elsewhere that whenever he closed in on Piastri, his own tires immediately started to overheat in the dirty air, killing any real chance of a move before it could even develop into a genuine attempt, a pattern that repeated itself almost every single time he got within striking distance. Not really a car problem in the way we've discussed all season, and not a driver problem either. Just bad luck in terms of who he happened to be running behind on a circuit that punishes exactly this kind of dirty air battle more severely than most stops on the calendar. None of these three things, on their own, changes the bigger picture. He's still sick, but insists it isn't affecting his driving, and there's no obvious sign from his lap times that it did. He was investigated, but cleared cleanly once the stewards actually looked at the footage rather than jumping to a conclusion. He was stuck all sprint, but that was as much the circuit's fault as anyone's, given how difficult overtaking has been at Zandvoort all weekend. Individually, each one is genuinely minor. The kind of thing that barely registers in a normal race weekend and wouldn't even make the headlines on its own, let alone become the subject of an entire video. Stacked together in the same 24 hours at what's supposed to be a celebratory farewell weekend, it paints a picture of a driver just trying to get through the day in one piece, physically and competitively, rather than a driver dominating his own send-off the way the script called for when the weekend was first previewed. And here's the part worth remembering, because we covered it in our last video. All of this, the illness, the investigation, the sprint frustration, is happening to a driver who just signed through 2030. None of Saturday's chaos changes that, regardless of how the illness, the investigation, or the sprint frustration is eventually remembered by fans looking back on this weekend. If anything, it's a reminder of exactly why that contract mattered in the first place, and why it was worth the size of the commitment involved, given everything that could plausibly go wrong on any given weekend. Red Bull didn't sign him because every weekend goes smoothly. They signed him because even on a weekend like this one, sick, investigated, and stuck in traffic behind a rival, he's still the driver they wanted locked in for the next 4.5 years, difficult weekends included, precisely because those weekends are the exception rather than the rule across his career. Everyone was expecting before Saturday got complicated in 3 completely different ways at once, none of which anyone saw coming when the weekend began. We'll be tracking every single lap of it, right through to the checkered flag and whatever comes after it. Smash that hype button, subscribe, and we'll see you at the checkered flag.